Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel. I'm the student and young adult worker here. And this evening, I'm speaking to us about the book of Amos. So, as I said, this is the next talk in our series looking at the minor prophets. And this series has actually been titled Come Back to Me. And you may have noticed from this title or from the contents of previous talks that there is an overarching theme of God's desire for his people to return to him, having turned away from his love. It's interesting, in the light of God's love and his desire for his people, that all of these talks so far have mentioned God's judgment, which might be a little bit it's one of those things that we don't like talking about, is it? Only last week, Tom was focusing on the wrath of God in his talk on the book of Joel. And it seems that there is some kind of link between God's judgment, or could we say justice, and his love for us. So this evening, we're going to be thinking about the book of Amos through the lens of justice. Justice seems to be a very heavy theme in a lot of the Old Testament prophets, minor and major. And there are many famous verses on the topic of justice in the Bible, such as Micah 6, verse 8, which gives us direction on how we live our lives. That's the act justly and love mercy and walk humbly. And then there's Matthew 5, verses 38 to 39, where Jesus talks about how we should repay evil, not with an equal action, but by turning the other cheek. And in Amos, there is one very famous verse, which is Amos 5, verse 24. And it says, "Let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream." So, just a little taster of the book of Amos. What do we think then when we think of justice or judgment? Perhaps it is something like a courtroom that you're picturing a person pronounced as guilty or innocent for a crime and given the correct punishment. Or maybe it is a person receiving what they've worked for or fought for, such as the ending of oppression for a group of people or an innocent person released from prison. And then there's the Bible. There's Jesus' command to turn the other cheek. And that doesn't actually sound a lot like justice on surface level, does it? It doesn't seem very fair. So to understand what biblical justice really means, we're going to take a dive into the book of Amos. So if you have a Bible with you or on your phone, please open it to the book of Amos. It is in the kind of second part of the Old Testament. We're not looking at a specific reading. I was given the kind of notes for this talk and there was just a whole bunch of random verses. So we're going to look at quite a lot of the book of Amos, but we've not got a specific reading. So please do just open it to the book of Amos. It's not a very long book. So let's start by having a think about who Amos actually was. Chapter 1, verse 1 says that Amos was one of the shepherds of Tekoa. And later in the book, in chapter 7, when Amos is challenged for his prophecies by the priest of Bethel, he says of himself, "I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" So it seems like Amos was a normal person working a normal hands-on job. He describes himself as a shepherd and a sycamore fig, I'm going to say farmer, I don't know what the right word for that is, but he looked after sycamore fig trees. Maybe in today's society, he could be a delivery driver or a plumber or even a warehouse operative. And despite having no formal academic or even religious education, God chose Amos to speak his words to those who needed to hear them. Amos was, it is believed, from the southern kingdom of Judah. And this is after the time that Judah split from the northern kingdom of Israel. But although he was from the southern Judah, Amos was called to prophesy to the northern kingdom of Israel during a time when Israel was at the height of its political and economic power. Israel was doing really well in the eyes of the world, with power and status and comfort for its people, or most of its people. The problem is that Israel, it seems, thought a little too well of itself. The rich people were very rich, with multiple houses and beautiful possessions. But God warns Israel in Amos that he's going to tear down their winter houses along with their summer houses, and the houses of ivory will be destroyed and the mansions will be demolished. So they've obviously got lots of houses, and God doesn't seem pleased with all this wealth that the people have accumulated. Having a lot of money and comfort often leads to being able to distance yourself from poverty and need. And the implication of Amos's prophecies is that the wealth and comfort being experienced in Israel was built at the expense of the vulnerable. Now, if we go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, that's quite a lot closer than these times that we're thinking about in the Bible. Britain seemed to be at the top of its power in the world. It was economically and militarily powerful. Britain had control over about a quarter of the whole world at the peak of the British Empire in the early 20th century. But this empire was built on the backs of enslaved people and was sustained by the oppression of people and entire nations. But those who benefited from this were not really seeing the first-hand injustice and oppression that had created the wealth that they had. It seems that this northern kingdom of Israel was in a similar position, although probably at a much smaller scale. But the people who had much were so far removed from the people who had little that they had turned their backs on them, or at the least they had turned their eyes away and had hardened their hearts. It says in Amos 2, verses 6 to 7, "For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent." This is God talking to his people. "Because they sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals." The wealthy people of Israel had resulted to enslaving other human beings for material gain, much like Britain did in more recent history. But as far as the people of Israel were concerned, everything was going well. They had everything they could want, and they were getting even more. So let's keep this context in mind as we begin to think about what we can learn from the book of Amos. Amos begins his prophetic writing by declaring God's judgment not on Israel, but on the nations around Israel. So imagine this. Into Israel's wealth, comfort, and power, Amos comes in. It's probably a slightly strange sight. He's a shepherd, so, he's probably in the marketplace or outside homes. I don't really know, I'm just kind of thinking this up in my head, but this is what I'm picturing. We don't know who the people thought he was, but along he came and he began to prophesy against the nations surrounding Israel. And we can read these prophetic words in Amos chapters 1 and 2. And what kind of sin does Amos call out in these other nations around Israel? It is the sin of injustice and cruelty to people that he calls out in the nations surrounding Israel. Some examples are Tyre, the nation of Tyre, sold whole communities of captives to Edom, disregarding a treaty of brotherhood, and Ammon ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead in order to extend his borders. There are more, they're quite horrific. We won't read them all. You can read them in your own time. But they're all sins of oppression on other human beings. And can you imagine the crowd gathering around Amos? They probably loved him at this point. Maybe people were going off to fetch their husbands or their wives or their friends and colleagues to come and listen to him. And maybe we can kind of relate to that. It's really easy, isn't it, to criticize others? And I would imagine some of us are really quite good at it. And our criticism is often justified. Maybe it's the government doing something we think is really wrong, or political parties we don't support, or even individuals who have done something we disagree with, or that has hurt us, or has hurt someone we care about. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying that it is wrong to be critical where there is justification, because without criticism of authority, there may have been no end to the slave trade or the apartheid in South Africa. And Amos himself doesn't seem to hold back in his criticism of sin and injustice here. But after all of this criticism of the surrounding nations, Amos then, in what was probably quite a shocking twist of events, turns on Israel. He suddenly goes from calling out the nations around Israel and making them sound awful. He begins to call out the sins of the people around him. Can you imagine the looks on the faces of those who'd gathered around him just a little while ago, cheering him on? Amos goes from being cheered to probably having insults hurled at him. Some credit to this guy for keeping on going. We don't know what people said to him. I'm sure you can think of some things. And he is even reported to the king for his prophecies against the nation. But Amos keeps on doing what God has told him to, even though it made him incredibly unpopular. One of the challenges in the book of Amos is to look at our own hearts. We can call out injustice and sin in others, but we must look to ourselves too, to seek integrity and for our own hearts to be right with God. Amos, in his prophesying, makes it clear that while the nations around Israel had sinned, so had Israel. And it seems that God is even more angry with them, his own people, than with the nations around them, judging by the lengths of his words against them. And in this book, Amos reveals that the wealth and comfort that the people had were not a blessing, but rather were the tainted spoils from the mistreatment of those who were poor and oppressed. The wealthy of Israel had been exploiting the poor for their own material gain. And Amos has quite a lengthy list of accusations against Israel. This is not an exhaustive list, but we're going to look at a few. So Amos 2, verse 4 says, "For 3 sins of Judah, even 4, I will not relent, because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his decrees, because they have been led astray by false gods." So Israel have been worshipping false gods, gods who permit immoral living and promote the exploitation of fellow human beings. Amos 4, verse 1 says this, "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria." It's not very nice. "You women who oppress the poor and crush the needy and say to your husbands, 'Bring us some drinks.' These women have been oppressing the poor and crushing the needy to uphold their luxurious lifestyle." Amos 5, verse 11 says, "You levy a straw tax on the poor and impose a tax on their grain." It seems these people have forced high taxes for the poor for the material gain of the rich. And Amos 5, verse 12 says, "There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts." In Amos 6, we hear, "Woe to you who are complacent in Zion and to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria." The people have been complacent and have not been fulfilling their duties to God or to their fellow people. Amos 8, verse 5, it says, "When will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat?" Skimping the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales. So the people have been asking, when will these festivals be over so we can start trading again? They have been prioritizing profit over worship at the festivals of God and cheating customers with dishonest scales and high prices. And then we read again Amos 8, verse 6, saying that Israel has been buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. So essentially enslaving the poor because they are poor and they can't afford to pay for things. They need the money, so they've sold themselves. And that's quite an intense list. But it seems from this that God values the struggles of the poor. Perhaps this is something that we need to think about when we think about how we use the power that we have. Maybe it's our voting power or our spending power or even our words and the things that we say and what we do in business, if that's something we're involved with, and whether we value profit or gain over what is important to God. And how we wish that this matter of injustice to the vulnerable was a historical problem. It's not, is it? Even today, we see those who are at the top exploiting those at the very bottom in our modern world. And it is so easy, isn't it, to simply avert our eyes and keep on going. It's probably not because we don't care, but maybe because it's too difficult and it would be impossible to live a life that is untainted by this oppression. The clothes that we wear, the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, to name a few things, all of these things are in some way related to the exploitation of people and resources. And that's quite sobering to think about when we read what God has to say in the book of Amos. So what is the remedy then for this sin? We need to remember that God was not sending Amos just to annoy his people. He loved his people, and he loves you and me. And when we think about topics like this, sin and judgment and justice, we need to remember that our God is love. And like a caring parent does, God warns us for our good. In Amos 5, we read that the Lord laments for his people in this. In Amos 7, we hear of the Lord relenting from sending punishment. And in Amos 5, the people are told to seek good instead of evil. God loves us so much that he laments when we do what isn't good. He doesn't just laugh at us, and he relents, and he teaches us how we should live. But the people of Israel did not return to God, and there are consequences of this. There's quite a lot of consequences in the book of Amos that we read about. And maybe we think that the consequences Amos speaks about are things that God has done actively. Or maybe God's judgment is really perhaps the consequences of their own actions. Because I believe that God's justice is woven into the fabric of the world that he's made. We only have to look at history to realize that the oppression of the poor in many civilizations has led to uprising and revolution, and therefore war and hardship for many people. And we can learn from history as we can learn from these warnings of the prophets in the Old Testament. Amos warns in Amos 6, verse 14, "The Lord Almighty declares, I will stir up a nation against you, Israel, that will oppress you all the way from Lebo Hamath to the valley of the Arabah." And eventually, the land of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, as Amos had warned. And whatever you think of the judgment of God, it is worth understanding that human beings also have an innate God-given sense of justice. And whether it was Israel's pride that had brought on a reaction from the nations around them, or whether God had told others to invade them directly, that is a mystery. We don't know. And we can't control the will of God. But we can choose to turn to God rather than worship the idols of money and power. So what should be our response? I believe that we are called to transform culture by worshipping God the way he wants to be worshipped. God says to his people who have turned away, "Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings," that was the way that they worshipped then, "I will not accept them." God didn't want a worship that was performative, going through the motions of what we're supposed to do, but not touching the heart. So what is true worship then? What does God want from us if he doesn't want us to just go through the motions? Maybe it is a new dance move. We can ask Sai to demonstrate later. Or maybe it's a different amount of money for us to give. I don't think that's it. And this famous verse that I mentioned earlier, Amos 5, verse 28, I think points to more what God is getting at here. It says, "Let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream." This is what God wants. That's great. What does that mean? It's a very beautiful picture, but what does that really mean? You've probably watched some of the videos by the Bible Project, maybe in Life Group or even on a Sunday. And I watched their video that they did on the book of Amos whilst writing this talk because it felt like a good place to start. They're very good at explaining biblical truths to us in a way that doesn't sound super confusing. And in their video on Amos, they describe justice as actions to correct unrighteousness. So this tells us that justice is something that is done. It is not an abstract moral concept. So we need to understand what fairness is, what actions to correct unrighteousness are, and how injustice has come about in order to be able to do justice. If we can say do justice. I don't know if that's grammatically correct. So with an understanding of what justice is, we need to understand what righteousness is in order to be able to correct unrighteousness. And in their video, the Bible Project helpfully described righteousness as right, equitable relationships. Right, equitable relationships, fair relationships. And this is what God has always wanted for us, for the beauty of difference in human beings to be celebrated as just that, beautiful, and not something to be exploited or used against others. In her book, Embracing Justice, which was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book for 2022, sounds a while ago now, Isabel Hamley brings us back to the creation story in Genesis to understand what justice really means to God. She frames it within the context of the time that the Old Testament was written, and she says, in the ancient Near East, many stories about the creation and the beginning of the world circulated, and they usually undergirded the claim of one specific individual, the king, or the leader, and his descendants. Kings were often said to be made in the image of God, the only human beings made in the image of God. Normal people belong to a different class, or sometimes different hierarchized classes. In contrast, in Genesis, all human beings, plural, are made in the image of God. All of them, not just the king, nor even people of status, and not just men, but all, including, perhaps most shocking of all in patriarchal culture, women. She quotes Genesis 1, verse 27, that says, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." And she says that this tells us that there is no value difference between human beings. Whoever they are made in the image of God, uniquely precious with infinite dignity and worth. That sounds really beautiful, that each of us are uniquely precious and have infinite dignity and worth. So justice and fairness is based on this premise that all human beings are equal in the sight of God, and so should be in our eyes. And Jesus defined the law in these two commands, to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbour as ourselves, our neighbour being everyone. And these 10 commandments all come down to these. We give God ourselves, and we treat others with the dignity and honour that they deserve as children of God and as equals to ourselves. So, we have a choice. Do we face the consequences of our actions, the injustice in our society widening, or do we choose to turn back to God and fight that injustice? To let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream? We're not going to solve unrighteousness and injustice in a church service on a Sunday. We're probably not even going to solve it in our lifetimes. But it is in our Monday to Saturday and Sunday lives that we need to do these things. Because just as human beings have an innate sense of justice, which I believe is God-given, human beings also possess a greed rooted in fear to have more and more, to become safer, to have more comfort. And this greed, I believe, comes from our rejection of God in choosing to sin. We don't rely on God, and so we feel that we need more to be able to be safe. And it is sin itself that has turned people away from viewing one another as equal and deserving of dignity. So we need to respond to Amos's warning against the sins of injustice and complacency. We are absolutely not following Jesus if we simply come to church on a Sunday, give our praises to Jesus, but not do what he's called us to do. So how can we do this? Amos was unpopular because he followed God and chose to speak out against his own people and to call out their sin. Maybe we might become unpopular if we start to call out immoral things in our lives, immoral business or financial practices, or the things that society calls okay, which are not okay in God's eyes. Consumerism or selfishness, things that benefit us materially, but at someone else's expense. Jesus did say, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. That's in Matthew 19, verse 24. I don't think Jesus said this because being rich is bad, but rather because wealth can corrupt us and can make us hold on more dearly to what we have because we mistakenly believe that we deserve it. And bear in mind that when a rich person gives 10% of their income, the 90% left over could be much more than the poor person even started with. Yet it is often those who have less who give a greater proportion of what they have to church or to charity. We love to believe that you can do anything you want if you work hard, when so many people begin at a disadvantage already, whether that is geographical, ethnic, a class, or an economic disadvantage, we need to remember that just because the world has seemingly always worked this way does not mean that it is right for it to work this way. It does not mean that it is a God-ordained order. We as Christians are called to be different in the way that we live. We are told, do not conform to the patterns of this world in Romans 12. This doesn't, as I think some Christians think it does, mean to be a real Christian, you have to be weird. I'm sure we have all met a few weird Christians in our time, and Jesus dearly loves them, and so do we. But I have seen that weirdness is often a big culprit in putting other people off Jesus. How much more compelling instead, then, is God's idea of justice? How much more compelling than just being weird is treating others with dignity and kindness? I'm not saying that the people who are weird don't treat people with dignity and kindness. But how compelling is that? Living out this justice and righteousness as a fulfillment of Jesus' great commission to bring his gospel to those who don't yet know him. Not conforming to the patterns of selfishness in this world, but to the patterns of generosity of Jesus' kingdom. And if we're telling people that Jesus is great, but not living like him, don't we look a little bit hypocritical? And hypocrisy is often a massive turn-off to the church, and I believe that the younger generations are particularly disgusted by it. And the UK church is hemorrhaging younger generations. And yet, the younger generations are the future of the church. If we want the name of Jesus to be proclaimed on into the future, we need to do something about this. Society loves to create divides between those who have and those who have not. It might be noticed that there are cheaper and more expensive areas to live in, and that these areas attract good and bad amenities accordingly. Or good schools attract people to an area, so the house prices rise, and in turn people are priced out for opportunities for their children. And so maybe we end up often living in places where we rarely see those who are different to us. And if we live in a wealthier area, perhaps we very rarely see those whom the world has not treated so well. And we definitely don't often see those people halfway across the world who produce the things that we own, our clothes, our phones, and our food, to mention a few things. But we don't see the oppression that might be going on to create those things. Don't let that not being able to see make you complacent. So how can we soften our hearts to those who experience oppression? And how can we stand against the systems of this world that cause oppression? I think first we need to think about what we worship. If we, like the people Amos was speaking to, choose to worship money or possessions or even comfort, then we will inevitably not be letting justice roll like a river. There is nothing inherently wrong with having nice things, or even with being comfortable, but there is a danger with comfort and wealth that we become apathetic to the needs of those who have less than us. And I'm not going to be one of those people who stands in front of a church and tells you that you're all really wealthy and you should be really grateful because you live in a very safe area in the UK. Because while it is true that the very few hold the vast majority of wealth in the world, and a lot of that is held in the Western world, there are a lot of people who own many houses and many cars, and some of us who own neither. And I have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with right now, so I won't patronise you by saying that you are wealthy. Food bank use in the UK is at an all-time high, and that suggests to me that we should not be so cavalier in deciding who is rich and who is poor. Poverty is around the world as well as on our doorstep. But for some of us, perhaps we do have a level of comfort that makes it more difficult to understand the struggles of those who do not. A slightly silly example to lighten the mood. It doesn't feel so silly on a Wednesday night after a long day, perhaps. But a slightly silly example is that I would dearly love the comforts of a dishwasher in my house. My current dishwasher is about 6 foot tall and eats cheese directly from the fridge, which isn't very convenient and, to be honest, can be a bit bad-tempered after a long day at work. Now, I used to live in a flat with a lovely little mini dishwasher, and I look back fondly on the times that I could just pop my dishes in the dishwasher, pop a tablet in and press the button, ready to wake up in the morning to clean dishes. And no, I didn't mind putting them away. But when I had spent an evening cooking, being able to put the dishes into the dishwasher rather than seeing an overwhelming pile of dishes on the side was a real blessing. And the time it takes to wash a whole day's worth of dishes is ridiculous. I never thought of that. And how I ache for that time of my dishwasher back, and how I took it for granted when I had it. It is perhaps a bit of a silly example. I don't do most of the dishes in my house. I do most of the cooking though. But I have learned that it is easy to take for granted what we have and begin to worship the things that we have rather than the one who has given them to us. One way to stop taking things for granted, to soften our hearts and to turn our worship back onto the gift giver rather than the gifts, is by being radically generous with what we have. And I'm not going to mention these things because I do them perfectly. I very, very often fall short of the Lord's desire for justice and equitable relationships between his people. So please don't take this as me telling you what to do and me having it all together. But there are ways that we can use what God has given us to lift others up or to support them or help them. So how can we love our neighbours as ourselves with what we have? Proverbs 9 verse 17 says, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deeds." When we do these things, we are doing them for God as well. And more challengingly, the early church in Acts 4 lived in a way that challenges our consumerist capitalist culture in quite a striking way. Acts 4 verses 32 to 35 says that all the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed any of their possessions as their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there was no needy person among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. What a beautiful sense of community and love for one another, and how much it contrasts with the Israel that Amos was prophesying to. Instead of building wealth upon wealth and oppressing the needy in exchange for even more wealth, the wealth that was had was shared so that everyone had enough. Imagine a world where everyone has enough, where there is fresh water readily available to all, where children can eat their fill and so can their parents, and where every person has access to the same quality of education and opportunity. Those are just a few things. If everyone had enough, how amazing would it be? And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, Rachel, that is a lovely idea, isn't it? That sounds lovely, but it's never really achievable, is it? And yeah, it does sound a bit idealistic. But in the same way that a house, or this centre even, was built by individual bricks or pieces, culture is shifted, I think, by individual actions that accumulate to create something new. So how can we then choose to not be of this world and to choose to reject self-worship and the worship of money and possessions? Maybe think about what you have. What could you do with the things that you own or things you possess to bless others? How could you share your money or your time with those who have needs? Are there charities that you could donate to, your time or your money? Or are there people who you could share your possessions with? Is there someone even that you could just offer a lift home to from something? Or are there clothes you could donate to someone you know has a need? Do you have the means to buy food for the food bank in your weekly shop? This is not me shamelessly asking for the use of your dishwasher. I'm not really sure how that would work. But what could you do for those who don't have what you have? The more of these things you do, the more little bricks you add to building a culture of God's kind of justice. Secondly, though, how can we stand against the systems of oppression? And I believe that we also must challenge our viewpoint. Find ways that you can draw closer to those who are not like yourself, ways that you can actually see what is happening in our world. Rather than using any privilege that you have maybe to distance yourself from difficulty or difference, instead, try to befriend people who are not like you, and not just as a charity case, because that's not nice, We need to remember that Jesus made real, true friends with all of the outcasts in society at the time, people that weren't like him, people that were like him, and people that most people didn't like. And perhaps we need to do the difficult thing and step into the circles where we don't feel quite so safe, to try to understand one another and to build unity and love. And we must also, where we can, fight against injustice and oppression in our world. What are the injustices that anger you right now? Injustice against the poor, food poverty, injustices of racial or ethnic inequality, injustices against the LGBTQ community or against women. There are so many injustices in our world that we could stand against. But think about how you can support those who already stand up for those who are suffering injustice. What would it look like to speak up when you see injustice happening at work or at school or in your community? Amos warns us not to be complacent in these matters of injustice, not to turn a blind eye or to harden our hearts, because God loves each of us as his precious children. You are a child of God. But also, those people you see on the news rushing for food parcels from a truck in the desert are children of God. The people you see hanging outside the job centre are children of God. That person at work who really annoys you is a child of God. Those people on a protest through the streets are children of God. Each person is a human being made in the image of God. And if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, it is our duty to do what is in our power to ensure that they are treated as his children. This talk has been titled Unpopular Love, but I'm not encouraging us to pursue unpopularity. Amos himself was an unpopular man to the people he prophesied to, because he was giving a message that they didn't want to hear. We will also find today that God's version of justice comes across as very radical and countercultural today, where God's children are often pitched against one another and seemingly must choose one side or the other. How can we learn to see each other as the images of God that he created us as? Maybe you feel that perhaps you've turned a little away from God, going through the motions but not living the life he has called you to. And you want to think about how you can begin to turn back. Amos reminds us that God loves us. He doesn't want us to remain with our backs turned to him. He is the God of many chances, and he will keep pursuing you.